Okay, so welcome to our last roundtable, correct, on a extremely important subject, bringing everything back to differentiation, dominance, and of course democracy, which is a roundtable on the question of the external threats to European democracy. And I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce 4 super interesting speakers. Super interesting because they are, of course, extremely qualified, but also super interesting because they will wake us up and bring us a little bit further away from the European Union-centered, focused discussion that we had over the last 2 days. So I'm very happy to present first Joanna Skoczek, who is Deputy Permanent Representative of the Republic of Poland to the United Nations, New York, and has a very long experience in other places, amongst others in China, and I think a number of us will be very interested to hear about that as well. We have then Marzenna Guz-Vetter, who is the head of the representation of the Commission in Warsaw, who, if I'm not mistaken, has studied here as well at the Jagiellonian University.
No.
You didn't?
Not here.
Not here.
I studied, but not here.
I thought I had a panel where everyone at one point either worked here or studied here.
I studied.
We have then Emilian Kavalsky, who is Professor of International Relations, and who told me that he had absolutely no idea about the European Union, which is of course wrong, and we will hear about that later. And Matteo Bonomi, who is Senior Fellow in the EU Politics and Institutions Program at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. And again, very happy to have you here. The subject of this last roundtable is, as I've already said, the external threat to European democracy. And the first overall question that I asked is a very provocative one. I wanted to know whether there is really an external threat to EU democracy. And I asked this question very, very quickly to tell you, because I'm in this EU studies area field for a very long time, and I have the impression that I see the same questions popping up over and over again. So at the beginning of the years 2000, we already had a discussion about a democratic deficit, but at that point it was an internal democratic deficit. Okay, we didn't talk about the external threat. We were talking about questions of populism, we were talking about questions of the extreme right, we were talking about the fact that the citizens were not invited to participate in decision-making processes. And then we had, of course, the famous Lisbon Treaty, which for the first time decided that we had representative democracy and we had participatory democracy. So, the NGOs were invited to participate more strongly. Today, however, the question in the general realm, in the general discussion, is much broader. We ask the question of what is the external threat? Is there an external threat to the internal democracy? We have cyber attacks on critical national and European infrastructures. We have external influence in national election campaigns. We have social networks and their control. And we have the question about artificial intelligence. We had already discussed yesterday and again today. But these will be now linked particularly to the question of the external threat. So what I suggest is that every panelist has about 5 to 7 minutes to answer 3 rounds of questions. These are very broad questions, and of course the panelists are free to say, well, this is not the question that I would like to answer. I would like to answer another one, and you feel free to do so. So the first question will be, does external differentiation of the EU increase external threats to European democracy? Your turn. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And let me start by usual disclaimer that what I'm going to say are my thoughts and ideas and not necessarily of my government. However, I hope my government would be happy to hear what I'm saying. But they are rather coming from the 20 plus years of my work in public administration and in diplomacy. We just discussed with Sabine a little earlier that I will not maybe exactly answer the first question. I would rather address the question, is there really a threat to EU democracy? And how I understand this question is that does European construction is in a way jeopardized or threatened by some external aspects or actors, or is it possible, are these external factors are able to disrupt this European way of living, which is our trademark, and the main reason why the European model is still so attractive? So now the first question that I'm asking myself is, what is this biggest asset of the European Union that might be compromised or, if you will, threatened? Is it the current institutional order that we discussed in depth earlier today? Is it this unique division of power? Is it directly elected parliament, if we are speaking about democracy, so the elements of European democracy? Or maybe it's the ability of European Union to stand behind the universal values? So I would like to give you two examples, and then you can judge whether it will in any way answer the question. First is a minor one, but let's start with this institutional architecture as a risk factor. Believe me or not, but you are probably the very rare people who can tell the difference and understand between the internal division of power in the European Union and the difference between European Council and Council of the European Union and so on. And probably you can even convincingly argue that it makes sense to send in the same time for a meeting with the authoritarian leaders of big powers, in the same time, the President of the European Commission and the President of European Council. Well, what we inside the EU perceive as our strength, as almost perfect democratic construction, mirroring both the checks and balances and also the diverse institutional interests. From the outside, it looks like a product of lack of decisiveness and coordination. And it's not just the confusing arrangement for the partners, but it causes protocol problems, and it's something that these big powers really dread of. But also it arises the temptation among our external partners, especially those that are not necessarily totally friendly to us, to use it as a method of dividing the European Union. And for me, that is the direct threat. Why? Because, well, why should an authoritarian leader, resist the temptation if he sees one to divide European leaders coming to see him? And it might be done by appealing to their ambitions, by dosing the privileges, by selecting the information that is passed on them, but most importantly, probably, by shaping the media image. And I don't need to go into details about the meeting of the European leaders with either Xi Jinping or Erdogan. You know it all too well. So ultimately, it might lead to the internal partitions that we don't want to see, and it might undermine the trust inside the EU. So we may think it's a minor threat, but I think it's still a manageable threat. But it might be one. But the second question and second example is maybe more important, and it is directly related to what I am doing right now. So being at the UN, representing my country at the UN. So. And I think it's more interesting also, and that is the position of the European Union towards the global South. And I use this notion of the global South for the lack of better notion. Please help me if you have any, but as far as I know, still even the global South uses the global South. So here we are. here we disposed as the European Union of an unparalleled assets, attractive model of governance of functioning, high contribution to the development and to assistance schemes, a large presence on the ground through both bilateral embassies and EU delegations. And nowadays, I argue that the Global South, in the context of the United Nations, is in the most privileged position. And not to underestimating the challenges that it faces. The Global South, generally speaking, is at the center of all the conversation concerning remodeling of the international order, concerning the development patterns and financing of the development. Because every major player is focused on attracting the attention and the interest of the Global South, on advertising advantages that they have, building relations, political and economic relations, and the outcome won't be a clear-cut. It will be an evolving outcome. But bearing in mind the potential, we need to have in mind that this race among big powers, so to say, is probably one of those processes that has very high potential to shape European Union future and influence it in the context of what we discussed today. And the most important part of the Global South in this context is Africa. And here there is a lot of aspects. Maybe we'll go to the details later on. But what I see is that EU seems to be in a very perplexed position in this race, because it is too confident and not confident enough in the same time, especially when it comes to Africa, but also to other regions of the Global South. Because this is the case of a combination of the post-colonial cliché and missed opportunities. And it's not my reflection coming out from the internal discussions in the EU. It comes from the discussions with the representative of the Global South, including the high representative of the UN. Because for many years, EU was slow or reluctant to change its mind on the issue of sustainable development. It was not, or at least it created the impression of not being interested or not caring, not proposing resolutions in the area of sustainable development, but then criticizing the drafts of the resolutions tabled by the Global South. And only very recently, and I would say it's a question of the past year, maybe year and a half, and to a large extent is correlated with the post-war, post-February period. So we now observe a very positive, in my opinion, change of heart. The biggest problem that I identify is not lack of money, it's not lack of knowledge, because European Union has it all. It's rather the question of communication, targeted and well-measured communication, because we are some 10 years late when it comes to the investment, and this field is, especially in Africa, already occupied by China, with all the strings attached. But the probably most important EU idea, most important EU investment and capacity building initiative, namely the Global Gateway, is perceived by the potential beneficiaries as designed and advertised solely in competition to the Chinese offer without value added. So now it's really a very big challenge for us to convince our partner that it's different. But I think what we should bear in mind, it's not that the Global South countries cannot tell evil from good. They can. They are really good at it. The thing is they don't want to take sides. But they can count, especially when it comes to their economies and their money. And after the Russian attack on Ukraine, we found ourselves in a bit different position, because we started to try to convince our Global South partners to different things. And we learned really the hard way how complex is this process of convincing them. Because they said, yes, we are totally in favor of the UN Charter, and we are against the breach of the UN Charter. But you always come to us with an offer, like take it or leave it, here is the resolution, either you are with us or you are against us, you have no right to put the amendment to that, and so on. Then they are accusing us, for a good reason, of selective approach, that we do not pay equal attention to the ongoing conflicts in Sahel, in Ethiopia, in Yemen, you name it. So, and they ask very pertinent questions that we don't ask ourselves. So I believe that we are at the point where we need to think and act quickly but reasonably. How can we defend the model that we like, the model of human rights focused, free market, democratic order? How to counterbalance the narrative of China and Russia when it comes to the global south and to the general direction of world's development? How to show the benefits and how to talk to the countries that would like to prosper and develop, but they see the impediments that result from the current world order.
Thank you very much. And we continue with a different view, I suppose, based on the European Union, but looking at how the Commission perhaps analyzes this particular question. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation to this beautiful place and this beautiful city. Always a pleasure to be in Krakow. So I would like to start with a reflection that the European Union was over the past years, de facto since it was founded in the 1950s of the past century, in a rather comfortable situation, because it was based on the main goal was to rebuild welfare and peace after the Second World War. Then we successfully also managed the big enlargement because of the revolution in Poland, because of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and de facto our security relied on the United States. Our welfare relied on imports of cheap energy from Russia, and our businesses relied on our exports to China. And the war in Ukraine, the Russian aggression towards Ukraine was de facto a complete game changer. So the global setup completely changed after this war, because the relations and the relation, especially of Germany towards Russia, had to underwent a big change, which is called the Zeitenwende. But you know, if the biggest economy in the EU has to change the pattern of its energy imports, they relied very much on cheap imports from Russia over the past years. So this is, of course, this has also economic implication on the European Union. So in my opinion, there is not a specific threat to European democracy from the outside, but there is something which can be even perceived as even more dangerous, because our security and our EU project as such is on danger. This is now the key point, and the Commission of von der Leyen, as from the very beginning, she was very focused on strengthening the global role of the European Union. But this needs, of course, special activities. And we know that due to the war in Ukraine, due to the changes, but also the rise of China, so we do not have the Pax Americana now. Yes, we have a multipolar world where there are other big players, like mainly China, but also Russia, but also India. They have different ambitions, and they tell us, well, now it's time for us to sit at this table. And so we are a bit also in the EU taken by surprise by all of this, because we very much profited from the globalization. And this is also a key topic that the European Commission takes care of, is that our dependency on imports of raw materials, especially from China, and high-tech products like chips from South Korea and from Taiwan, this is alarming. We even do not have a factory producing antibiotica. I think there is one in Austria, but no more, because we so much focused and relied on the benefits of globalization that we de facto forgot about strengthening also our industrial capacities. And the first alarming signal here was the pandemic and the shortages which followed in the delivery chains. So the European Commission is now launching a lot of projects, initiatives which are aimed at strengthening the competitiveness of the EU, also vis-à-vis the US. You know that the United States, they put on the market almost 400 billion euros just, yeah, where we have 700 billion euros from the Recovery and Resilience Fund. But, you know, this is accompanied by a huge administrative paperwork, yes. In the US, you tell you get it, and they do not care if there's a percentage is misused or not, but we are, this is a bloc with 27 countries with taxpayers' money, so we cannot act like the United States, yes, because a lot of things have to be discussed and agreed within all the countries. So the Commission very much under von der Leyen, she is very active also in terms of strengthening the presence of the EU on diverse international fora, but also she went to China. But before she went to China, which is even more, I would say, important, because her visit in China was overshadowed very much by Macron's visit, but before, she delivered a very good programmatic speech on the EU-China relations with the line to, so-called line to take, like we call it internally, that we have to de-risk, but not to decouple our relations with China. So there is a lot of going on in these terms, but this is the key problem now, how to keep the welfare and the European industry, but also defense industry going. Then as regards, of course, there are external threats to destabilize the EU. I would rather call it to destabilize the EU, because I think that our foundations, democratic foundations, are still very strong, and despite problems in some countries as regards the rule of law or freedom of media or other issues, so there is still, I would say that the EU is a unique project of respect for democratic rules, for human rights, for people's rights. So this, to destabilize this from outside, I must say I do not see this type of danger. However, what Ms. Skoczek said, that of course there are attempts to put at risk our unity, especially now as regards our policy towards Ukraine, and there. We can, of course, observe foreign interference, mainly from Russia, from China, towards, in terms of disinformation, political influence, lobby groups. Some say also that in another context there is an Islamic also interference towards the EU, which can be observed, I suppose, in France. The big question is what will happen in the US if we have once again Trump or somebody like Trump. So then I think we can say that indeed we will have not a very close ally. And on the global background, well, we have to fight to stabilize and to keep our, I would say, our pivotal role. So it's not our democracy, but our standing in the world, our political and economic leverage. This is, in my opinion, mainly on stake. as regards disinformation, so the Commission started together with member states a lot of initiative in this regard. There is a cooperation, there is a combating disinformation, but of course we cannot compete with trolls hired by Russia or by China, because these are completely different dimension. What we observe in Poland, but even more in Slovakia, is a very big influence of Russian trolls trying to undermine our solidarity with Ukraine. And also the Polish right party Konfederacja, which has more than 10% support now, is very much supported also by young people. There also we can observe anti-migrant narrative. And finally, so what the Commission will adopt soon is a defense of democracy package. This is within the European Democracy Action Plan, and the aim is to prevent foreign interference and to make a sort of transparency of activities where NGOs are sponsored by third countries. All this is very important against the background, of course, of the European Parliament elections next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marzenna. And we continue with Emilian.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Sabine. And I'm called by Sabine's initial introduction to kind of explain some of my flippant comments here, which I mentioned to her, is that I find myself uncomfortable here in this experts panel to which I'm participating, simply because my expertise, to the extent it exists, is in IR theory scholar, particularly post-Western and non-Western IR theory, global IR theory with Chinese characteristics. So to an extent I have any experience with democracy as well, is probably Chinese democracy, which I theoretically would argue exists as well. In this way, to answer Sabine's initial question, what is the real external threat to the EU, is probably EU democracy, is probably experts like me who are lecturing you guys here. So in terms of my response here to that question, in terms of EU's, what is there a real external threat to the European Union democracy? I guess my other qualification, I guess the previous speakers were far more eloquent than me in that sense, is saying that issues internal and external, there is something internally that's vulnerable that the external threat makes obvious and exploits. And I guess some of you in the previous conversations today, and yes, they were mentioning that EU has always been in crisis. There's always been problem and issues, and probably that's kind of like the modus operandi of the European Union. Those threats are something that keeps it going. My former supervisor at Loughborough University, Dave Allen, he was saying that once EU is no longer in crisis, that will be the end of the EU. So that's kind of like, that's for me, that's kind of, so I'm not concerned in that sense. So if I'm to answer the question in straight text from my, straightforwardly with from my ivory tower, in academia, is the real threat to EU democracy is, and I guess kind of like rephrasing in academic language what the previous speakers were saying, is infrastructures, in particular infrastructural thinking, infrastructural power, infrastructural agency, which first is rarely sovereign, most often non-state-centric, increasingly non-human, and is planetary in scale. And the European Union does not have the cognitive capacity to develop policy, or struggles right now to develop that policy, and then address meaningfully, develop meaningful measures for that. So what I mean here, so the first and obvious one is in terms of that particular kind of infrastructure. Some of you are talking about networks, and I think networks are a useful tool, methodologically, analytically, to explain these, but for me it's infrastructure, infrastructural power in particular offers a better explanation, is climate change in terms of the impact on EU democracy. It is as we've been talking about sovereign issues, state centrism and policy making at the EU level. We always talk about states and EU institutions. We talk about climate change, and addressing climate change is an issue which we need to kind of go beyond that kind of framework of thinking. And we don't have at the EU level, and not just at the EU level, as we've been seeing for how many years now, an attempt to reach some kind of global consensus on addressing it. And for me, the interesting thing here is that there was just a report this week that we're going to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius in threshold in 3 years rather than 20 years. And this is not a confrontation with reality. For me, it's very interesting in terms of the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the conflict with Ukraine, is that there was all of a sudden energy security and independence from Russian energy sources became possible and thinkable, something which we could. So for me, what is this moment of confrontation reality about addressing climate change? And because as we've seen during the pandemic, and which was, again, there's human, non-human, anthropogenic forces and climate change impacts on that, was very difficult even at the European level. We went into our own silos, our national silos, and who's going to get the COVID vaccines first, and took a while for the European Union to develop that. And it was a very minor event in terms of challenging policy making and practices of states and EU institutions. My second, and I guess the previous speaker mentioned more about that, is in terms of digital fracturing and digital infrastructures, which are fairly complex, but which other powers, other actors on the global stage, which quote unquote challenge the European Union, such as China, are already deploying very actively and on a planetary scale. Whether it's the global south across the world, whether it's actually China, I would argue things in transplanetary terms as well, in terms of its infrastructural power. And what's infrastructure here is not just the hard physical infrastructure in terms of roads, cables, information networks, digital technologies, is also, for me here, is the flow of ideas, the flow of standards, the flow of norms, the normative power. When we talk about the European Union, this is one of the first concepts, ideas that comes, is normative power. And there are several levels, so several layers to this digital dependency here. And then I think this package that the European Union is currently developing, or European Commission rather, is developing in terms of defense, the democracy, has the very big component is digital autonomy and digital independence because of that strong dependence on other factors. Yet, and this is a project we're on the digital fracturing, the colleague of mine from University of Bonn, Maximilian Meyer, we just had the first set of data, is the, autarky, I don't pronounce this word properly, autarky, like full autonomy and full dependence. The only country which is somewhat close to this full autonomy is the United States. All the other countries, especially European states, are deeply interdependent with other partners in both private and public, public actors in such digital dependence. The only countries within the last 5 years have, we have a set of 24, 25 countries we look at, is only China, South Korea, and Kenya have moved towards digital independence, which is very interesting for Kenya in terms of global south, how they benefit from this confrontation. What's also happening here, and it's like people or scholars such as Trine Flockhart have articulated far better than me, is in terms of this multi-order world, which these infrastructural capacities are setting. And Amitav Acharya, from a different perspective, speaks about multiplex world order, where we have parallel orders. It's not just one order. And in this context, for me, the threat that I'm kind of gesturing to from this infrastructural thinking is that the EU so far lacks the realization that it needs to develop such infrastructural capacities, which then leads to what the previous speakers were speaking especially about its weakness in the global south. China has the infrastructure in terms of not just roads, schools, educational facilities. For the past, from 2013 to 2019, there have been more students educated on scholarships in China than in the global north, in the US. And this is 2-3 generations down the road. So all of us have been different ways socialized into Western mores, especially us here in Eastern Europe, through programs, through Soros, through British Council, through Alliance Française, all these, and 2-3 generations down the road, we're going to have policymakers who have been through that system. This is infrastructure. This is infrastructure that China is building through education. So for me, this is one of the main external threats, which is pointing to a flaw within the way the EU conceptualizes itself is, as some of you are mentioning, because of your experience, it's navel-gazing and preoccupation with institutional structures. It misses these broader patterns that are happening in other parts of the world. And this one, I'll stop for a sec.
Thank you very much. And we continue.
it's difficult to continue after such a global perspective and so much forward-looking. I would try just to go a bit back to the European Union and to this differentiate and to look more at EU surroundings, because if the EU has a global role, it starts from its surrounding. And if we look at the discussion about democratization and democratic threats to European democracy, I mean, for years we have been mainly looking at how external threats could amplify all the challenges we were discussing even this morning about EU democracy. I think the return of war, the war in Ukraine, somehow changed also that discussion. Now suddenly our perception of democracy is of EU democracy not only is better, but also somehow it returned to be not only under threat, but an instrument to reply to external threats, suddenly and somehow in an unexpected way. And we see how this has an impact, especially in the reflection and in the discussion about differentiated integration. I mean, especially after Brexit, after the rise of Euroscepticism and so on, somehow differentiated integration seems the only way, external differentiation, only way to search for constructive relationship between the EU and its surrounding. And so to find a way to accommodate exactly this democratic crisis that was European but also national at the same time. The war has completely changed that world, that reality. Suddenly, there seems to be much smaller space, gray area between the EU and its surrounding. And also, the EU is asking to the country in its surrounding to have much more clear stance towards its value, towards its standards, and so on. So today, as a direct consequence of war, we are confronted with a reality, especially that is characterized by a strong demand of de-differentiation, I would say. We see internally, I mean, this debate about internal capacity. Of course, this is a common capacity. It's some sort of de-differentiation of national capacity, because simply the single member state cannot do by their own. But also externally, I mean, enlargement is a demand of de-differentiation. They want to become part of the club on equal basis. And somehow, I mean, and this is the most surprising thing so far, I think that both the elites and the public in Europe have supplied for this a positive response to this demand. I would say also quite unexpectedly. It was quite different from previous crises. We have seen that the European Council in 6 months decided to grant candidate status, to open accession negotiation with 2 countries that were waiting for at least 60 years. And so on. I mean, in 6 months, the supply provided by the European elite at the EU Council for integration were higher than in the last 6 years. But also, if you look at the European public, I mean, if you look at the Eurobarometer opinion of the, I mean, the usual question about how do they see the future enlargement of the EU, summer 2022 was historical peak, historical high since the beginning of the Syria. So it's 57%, even higher than early 2000s. Of course, this is just part of the picture. And the big question will be how this momentum will last, and which kind of enlargement policy will come out from this exceptional condition. And I think against this background, I think find more effective way to think about the enlargement policy. It's really the key to somehow overcome also the limits that we have seen about EU enlargement policy applied to post-war country and society. We have seen how these have been evolving with the Western Balkans, for instance, And we can imagine that many of those dynamics, also these functional dynamics that we have been seeing through the launch of the stabilization and association process will be there also in the future with the Balkans, but also with the three more countries that have applied. So I think really find a way to apply this pre-accession, this enlargement model to states that are in the process of nation building or state building, to have a resolved constitutional issue. I think it will be the key. I think there is a margin, and I think in this respect also some idea, some of this discussion about differentiated integration could somehow offer some original way of thinking, not on how to give an alternative to full membership, but how to construct tools that could be added to the pre-enlargement package in order to somehow have a policy that is really capable to strengthen democratic institutions, to support stability, but also to strengthen economic convergence and all these elements that have been missing by simply applying the former enlargement model, for instance, to the Western Balkans.
Thank you very much. I think we have already a very rich feedback on the first, let's say, two questions. And now I'm putting a second question in front of you, which is also linked very much to the EU3D project, and which brings in the term of dominance. So my question is, to what extent does external dominance influence internal EU democracy? And you're entirely free to define what you understand under external dominance. We had a whole panel yesterday, and apparently we did not arrive and get to a final definition. So you're free to redefine all that and to tell us whether there is an influence of external dominance on internal democracy. The floor is yours, Joanna.
Oh. Well, so I'm not sure whether I will fit into this methodological, framework that you have, and probably I have this freedom of not being bound by your discussions from the last 2 days, so yesterday morning. But seriously, when again I will speak from this more global perspective, how EU is perceived. Because if we speak about the dominance, we can think of European Union being one of the leading dominant forces on the global scene. So then if we understand it that way, so that we are on an equal footing with, say, US, China, to some extent Russia, but less and less, especially in the context of the UN, it's not the same. India here, I wouldn't fully agree, because I think India is still playing well below its weight category. But then G77, so the big group composed of 143 countries. I think that's a good question for an exam on global policy. How many countries are in the G77 and why not 77? But believe me, many people in UN are pretty sure that's 77 still. Anyway, so if we position ourselves as the European Union on that level, that means that we also try to be as united as possible in our message and in our policies. And most of these policies and the positions that we are taking are agreed in Brussels. So when we meet in New York or Geneva, for that matter, but mostly in New York, we mostly work on something that has been already agreed by either European Council in the European Council conclusions, or maybe by Foreign Affairs Council, it depends. Or there is a common position that was worked out by the COHOM or CONUN, so one of the working parties dealing with either human rights or United Nations. But then you would be surprised how much time we spent on coordinating ourselves. So we spent really long hours negotiating our positions on the plethora of subjects, from the enactment of the International Day of Pastures and Grasslands, to the quality standards of infrastructure, to the level of presence at commemoration of Nakba, so the Palestinian I wouldn't say, well, let's say day of commemoration. So we spent together more time negotiating among 27 that we later spent negotiating among 193. And oftentimes we do it just for the sake of negotiations, because we know from the start, and it's common knowledge, that none of our proposals, especially those more progressive ones, so to say, can hold during the negotiations. But we present ourselves as a united, ambitious group, having a clear and strong opinion, and we are ready to defend this opinion if need be. So just as in every other negotiation, you enter the negotiation with relatively high demands just to go a little down and then finish at the level that is accepted to everyone, but still you don't have this feeling that you lost everything. So it makes sense sometimes it doesn't. But so here I would see this dominance as we have this dominant opinion or strong dominant as a noun here, not as adjective, of our foreign policy or our position in different global issues. But I would then now, having said that, and also absolutely being of the opinion, it sometimes helps a lot, especially smaller countries with smaller missions, who cannot follow all important discussion at the UN, and especially as long as they are in the mainstream, they can focus on the things that are most important from the point of view of their national interest, while the European Union is covering basically every other subject. So apparently the only or mostly advantages of maintaining this unity at almost all costs. But sometimes the search for consensus makes us land in a gray area of either abstention or lack of opinion, a lack of clear position. And in such cases, I believe that showing that there is diversity of opinion that we respect might do less harm than we assume. Because more harm is done when we are all unhappy with the result, and you are perceived as lukewarm by our partners. We are somewhere in the middle ground with no position at all. And as long as we are able to communicate that this diversity is our strength, and the practical realization of the motto, united in diversity, we can control the message. Because after all, United Nations is an organization composed of sovereign states, and in EU, we leave certain areas of policy to the discretion of the member states. And that is how we can demonstrate in practical terms that the EU democracy is alive. And we are true to our values, and we respect the freedom of speech. So for those countries that for whom European Union values is still a bunch of quite attractive ideas, might be more convinced to align with us than if they see that 27 countries, simply in order not to enter into some kind of internal, not a conflict, but at least not agreeing totally on an issue, are just landing somewhere in between, and there are issues where we never even try to have a common position, which is it's probably not a secret. It's Palestinian package and whatever related to Middle East peace process, because the national interests are so different. But we have these discussions, and we think that we may do better by being well prepared for discussion, and by standing and staying true to our values so that we can say yes. That's something that you aspire to.
Yeah, so I must admit that this question is too abstract for me. so sorry. So I will just answer what I would like to say about this issue. But I followed yesterday a panel debate, but to define for me what is an external differentiation. No, maybe we will learn. Anyway, so I think that given this changed geopolitical role we are in with the war against Ukraine, with the rise of China and all the changes which you presented, what's going on the forum of the United Nations, that the EU has somehow become a hostage of our institutional setup. We have, because everything is based on a compromise. So if the European Council meets, they spend hours in order to agree on adjectives. And the final decisions are so watered down that if you do not follow in detail the previous discussions, then you even do not know what you have to search for in the final document, which word matters, yes? And so this we observe, and we also observe that the recent European Council, so maybe these issues are becoming too complex, even for the heads of state. So in the past, they were, sitting there 2-3 days. And now, if there is no discussion about the EU budget, it's over. After some hours we have, then all of them go to the media, and everybody interprets it like he or she wants. So there is a discussion. So what to do about it? And one opinion is, which is very much also supported by Commission President von der Leyen, but also which was in the speeches of the EU speeches of Scholz and Macron, different to the speech, the programmatic speech of Poland's Prime Minister Morawiecki. So. If there should be a majority voting. So the Commission, Germany, France, they want a majority voting in terms of external and security policy, and in the end, even to broaden the scope of this voting. I can understand the Polish position that, for member states which joined very late the EU, there is I would say there is a desire, or there is a more push for sovereignty, yes, for an own say, and there is of course maybe a justified fear that there would be a strong dominance by those who are the key players. So for the time being, there is no answer to this, because then I don't know, we would have to change the treaties. And so far, nobody has an appetite on opening this Pandora's box. And the other point is, which we could, I think, be closer on cooperation, is to think about how we can better shape future enlargements, which would, of course, then by enlarging the EU, enlarging the single market, enlarging our power. Which would be handled in a less complicated way than it was in the past. But this would, of course, mean that we have to take fundamental decisions about the future of the structural funds and the agriculture funds. Yes, because I cannot imagine that the French agriculture will say, okay, for agriculture funds from the budget to Ukraine, yeah, which is a key producer of agriculture products. So this is a key decision. If we will then share, or if we will resign, or we will abolish at all these funds or cut them. Nobody has a question to this. For the time being, it seems that it's under consideration, and it happens already with Ukraine, that Ukraine is applied for membership in the EU. This was confirmed, And Ukraine has been already granted a lot of rights and privileges, which Poland was only granted after becoming member of the EU. Yeah? So Ukraine got access to the labor market of the EU, got access to the EU market, which already produced a lot of tensions with Poland. Imagine that in the past years there were the imports of Ukrainian seeds, including maize, were 4 million tons to Poland, and out of this 3.2 million stayed in Poland, and only 700,000 million of tons went by the so-called solidarity lanes outside. So this, of course, introduced a big pressure on the agriculture, not only in Poland, but also in Hungary. And there is also a question of Western Balkans. Many of them are not satisfied that Ukraine is so much privileged now, because they are in the waiting line since years. So these are, I would say, this issue of majority voting, so changing the setup in our decision making, and the future of enlargement. These are the key questions which will shape our de facto our standing in the world in the next years.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Dominance is an interesting topic here, and I probably, like Ms. Skoczek here, I'll just talk with EU's dominance, but perhaps challenge EU's dominance here in terms of its normative power, and I'm going to look particularly at technology and technological standards. I think that's very unusual for quote-unquote Western countries or Western actors to find themselves lagging in technological innovation. And this is a new phenomenon in terms of, like, at least since James Watt invented the steam engine in the late 1700s, and Bell invented the telegraph. The part of the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, Western dominance of global patterns of relations are the, coming back to my previous point, infrastructures that were created with the help of those technologies. And the standards, norms, rules that traveled through the infrastructures built by those technologies. Yet when we go to now mobile technology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, space explorations, electric vehicles, we in Europe, the United States as well, are far behind where China is now, and lagging, and we find ourselves catching up. That's where digital dependence, digital autonomy for me, part of it is that this totally novel experience where we are no longer the norm setters in very real practical terms. And also it's not China. These are not necessarily, these are Chinese companies, but they're embedded in global networks and infrastructures of relations which are not necessarily Chinese as well, or controlled by those companies, as we have seen with the trade war and the chip war and all these different. So this for me is, in terms of dominance, is the, again, the digital part of it, or technological innovation part of it, which makes changes the patterns of relations here when we talk about dominance and EU's dominance here in terms of setting standards. Coming back to my other favorite topic, Chinese democracy here, is to kind of like, for me, I was working at the University of Nottingham campus in China, in the city of Ningbo, for 4 years, and it was very interesting for me because I'm a Chinese scholar and or observer of Chinese politics and Chinese affairs and Chinese foreign policy. For me, it's the very decentralization of Chinese decision-making, which is unimaginable for us outside of here in Europe. How decentralized it is, especially for those of us who come from communist countries or post-communist countries. Also, how different, quote-unquote, authoritarianism there is. It's very evolving. What Mr. Xi is doing and has done over the past few years is radical, but still China is very decentralized. The example here I have is the city of Ningbo. So, you know, there was this whole thing about East European countries being Trojan horses for China because of this 16+1, 17+1, whatever they were labeled. For me, this was echoing the new old Europe debate of the early 2000s when we were with the US in Iraq, and Monsieur Chirac said that we had missed a good opportunity to keep quiet. So there was kind of continuation of that kind of West-plaining discourse. But for me, what's interesting is that city of Ningbo is a population of 7.5, 8 million people. It is most East European countries are below or around that, with the exception of Poland, Romania. This is a third-rate city in China. It's not the capital of a province. It's not the capital of a country. The decisions on China's relations with Eastern Europe were made by the municipality in that one city. And for me, as an IR scholar who has been trained about anarchy, international relations, was fascinating to see the 16 or 17 when Greece joined in, trade ministers and ministers of foreign affairs of those Eastern European countries in Greece, member states of the European Union, most of them, are meeting with the mayor of Ningbo. Imagine a mayor of Krakow meeting with foreign ministers and trade ministers of Western European countries, or any country in the world. It's not, in our state-centric framework of international relations, I like the language, as we were discussing earlier. We don't have the language, and these were, Poland is a major member of the European. In here, in terms of fracturing as well, whether, in terms of dominance, for China understood something which I think France and Germany and other members of the European Union haven't understood, or at least perceived much earlier than it's happening now because of the conflict in Ukraine, is that power in Europe is moving to the east. And China very strategically and targeted approach to East European countries because they perceive those countries are important actors in the European Union, and there are some, and as members of the European Union, many of them have power over EU decision making. I'm not saying that China consciously tried to influence. This might have happened by accident or by design. Again, here when the Trojan horses statement was made in 2018, was mostly Hungary and Serbia were the countries or the actors in Eastern Europe that were targeted. Poland was very pragmatic in its relationship. Most of the countries that we've seen subsequently just found themselves in the same room with Beijing. It was not any love affair, meaningful one. But that's also brings me to another point about domination here and differentiation, actually. That's where I can perhaps contribute something to that conceptual idea, is that, for instance, a very small country such as Lithuania changed EU policy on China. The issue here, and Lithuania is not even 2 million people, it's on the peripheries of Europe in any way you look at it, yet it changed policies on China and sent a very, not just because of its normative, ideational, identity, whatever you can call them, or personal of the foreign minister, dissatisfaction or dislike of China, but also send a message to the Franco-German dominance over European Union policy on Asia, broadly defined. So they said, we are members of the European Union. We also want to participate in that. And I think that's, again, is this discourse on shift of power. And finally, going to one point on connectivity, which is my final point is, and that's where, in terms of the, and that's where I'm going to stop, is I was in January on a field trip in Bangkok, and they was talking about the European Union's what's called Global Gateway policy, the new thing. And my Thai interlocutor is saying, we don't take it seriously. It took the European Union 3 years to define the meaning of connectivity. China has already constructed the line and is building high-speed rail to Bangkok. So while we were, and this is kind of, again, going to this discussions about institution building, strengthening institutions, but also like what you were mentioning about, like while we are negotiating those things, the world doesn't wait for us as Europeans, I'm speaking here as a European, to make those decisions and agreements. I'm sorry I spoke too long.
It's always easy to speak after you. I will go back to Europe again. No, it's very fascinating what you have been saying. But I would try to think about the question on the other way around. I think if we have to think about the link between differentiation, European democracy, and dominance, I would see the connection moving from the problem of EU democracy towards its surrounding, because the asymmetry of power is just too big between the EU and its closest ally, especially, I mean, if we think in particular how EU conditionality has been evolving over this year, how the EU has been using the enlargement policy framework to cooperate in a huge hugely increasing amount of field. I mean, also the way we understand the EU conditionality, I think, has been changed a lot, and this changed somehow accordingly to the mutation that we have been observing within the functioning of the European Union itself. in particular, I think this rise of intergovernmentalism and the integration without supranationalization has been described, for instance, by Sergio Fabrini in many times. I mean, we have noticed how this mode of governance within the EU, the shift in the power within the EU, have created a union that somehow is little bit, maybe has been able to navigate through the crisis, has been able to maybe save the union, maybe with additional cost, a union that maybe has become a little bit less accountable because the main decision-making body is the European Council, decide at closed door without a lot of scrutiny, and has also fostered division between North and South member state, Eastern and West, and so on. I think all these characteristics we can find exactly the same in the way the EU has been managed its relation with third country, and in particular, if we look at how the enlargement policy evolved with the Western Balkans, we can see how there was a tremendous move towards intergovernmentalization of also that process as well. I mean, basically, between Thessaloniki and the Berlin process in 2014, they never met again. And then this just started to meet regularly, once a year, twice a year, before in small group, then also with the new enlargement methodology, basically it's now an obligation to meet every year. And they start also to coordinate a huge number of amount of policy, far beyond the simple Copenhagen criteria. They start to coordinate fiscal policy, especially to respond to the crisis, basically because even if they were not member of the European Union, but they were so much already integrated with the single market, their banking system were depending on the EU banking system, and so on, that basically there was not the political agency by this smaller partner of the European Union to have an autonomous policy reaction to this phenomenon. And we see this basically in all those sectors that has been central to the crisis of this year, that are not traditionally connected with EU enlargement policy, that is fiscal policy, that is use of force, how to manage the border, and so on. And we have seen how they have been also integrated in the Frontex, in Europol, in different agencies, and how there is basically a coordination on more policy sector, despite this is really outside the Copenhagen criteria. I mean, and all these things, as they have been probably ineffective, sometimes unaccountable and illegitimate within the European Union, I think we can see all these three diseases even more pronounced in EU cooperation with third countries of the Western Balkans. I mean, we can see how these countries have been integrated within the single market, but remain the poorest region with less access to funds. After the next generation EU, this gap has even strengthened. Croatia takes 10 times more per capita funds than the rest of former Yugoslavia, for instance. But not only, but if you look at this strengthening of national executive, of course, it's particularly problematic in countries that are in the way of democratic consolidation, as they are the West Balkans. And there are a lot of studies showing how effectively this process has been strengthening the executive within fragile democracy. And finally, has strengthened inequality between them and the other partner in the region already belonging in the EU. We can see about several disputes and how many member states have been weaponized the EU enlargement policy framework. But not only, we have also seen how this division have helped third country, for instance China, to jump in and to enter the sense that they were not equal to the others. So I would say that the relation go on the other way around. Problem in EU internal democracy somehow risk to be amplified and multiplied especially in the weakest EU surrounding that get implemented, that get involved and included into EU policy, but without somehow having a voice and without sharing as with the other member states the same amelioration mechanism, especially when there are crises. So this is quite problematic. I think we should think more thoroughly how all the cost also of integration, even if you are not full member, especially if you are a weaker partner of the European Union, I mean, we should invent mechanisms to somehow to help to overcome this challenge and to trigger a real convergence. I mean, enlargement with the country of Central Eastern Europe has been mainly about macroeconomic stabilization, about legislative transposition and so on. We should be even more ambitious with new enlargement policy in order to trigger a stronger process of convergence of policy, not only of legislation.
Thank you very much. What I will do now is I will skip the third question and tell you to answer, if you want to answer the third question, about what institutions, what formal and informal institutions should we think about in order to diminish the threat on internal democracy. I will tell you to answer this question when you answer the questions from the public. I think we have, I wasn't aware of that, but we do have a type of consensus here, which is no one really talks about the threat of external hegemons to the internal democracy of the EU. It's rather a challenge which is, constructed, built up internally. And I think this is a very interesting point of view that we got from 4 people who probably didn't talk about your interventions before you came here. So I open the floor to questions and comments.
Thank you very much for interesting presentations. I just have 2 comments. One is about the possibility to counterbalance Russia and Chinese narratives. And I think one point very important is to address history and colonialism, because they often present themselves as an alternative to the former colonizers in Africa or in South America. And my second observation is about democracy and how China actually operates. There's interference in elections, there's delegitimization of the EU, creation of alternative institutions. You have mentioned the China CEE Forum. But that's also, extraterritorial police, where China is arresting Chinese citizens on the soil of EU member states. But since we are here academics, I'd like to point to one aspect of Chinese influence on academic freedom, which is not so much addressed by the European Commission, and the EU, which have been reacting very fast to and efficiently to several of the threats in terms of technology, foreign direct investment and so on, but not that much in terms of academic freedom, which is actually only of supporting competence, right? But we very much impacted in terms of when we consider that China is buying business school or academic schools, funding some programs, or thinking of establishing universities, exercising pressure for censorship in Cambridge in particular, exercising pressure on academics, which I have experienced, And also, in the context of the global IR in international relations or decolonizing international relations, we see that there's an opening for publications from China, which is a good thing. But on the other side, we are flooded by a number of publications which we need to spend a lot of time on to check the scientific relevance of the publication. So that was a remark about this, I think, a very important aspect of Chinese influence directly impacting us. If you have some comments on that, thank you.
Just as a disclaimer, I'm not an academic, I'm a student here, so my knowledge is a bit more limited than most, I guess. I find it very interesting that on the one hand, it's often said that the power of the EU in its foreign policy is its normative power, what you might call its infrastructural power. At the same time, when we see how the EU engages in Africa, but also with enlargement, the enlargement process has really dragged on for a long time, and it has actually made joining the EU less popular in some countries. We've seen that in the Balkans, for example. At the same time, if we ask the question, why do, for example, countries in Africa turn to China for economic cooperation, it seems that this sort of conditionality plays a large role in that. China doesn't ask much from countries except for access to resources, for example, or investment opportunities. So to what extent can we say that this conditionality that the EU sort of imposes, which is its strength to an extent, can also become a weakness in creating this global infrastructure?
Maybe along the same lines of the conditionality question, I'd like to ask about the growing tendency of the EU to externalize perceived threats. And here I'm particularly thinking about migration and asylum policy. And maybe to go back to Joanna, your point that you made right at the beginning about how to, the EU has a problem in selling, right, its values, right, and this basis of human rights, particularly as a human rights-based order, particularly to the global South, and I wonder how it can mitigate, the interest that it has in externalizing, particularly migration and asylum policy in the global South, but also, going back to Matteo, what you said in the near neighborhood. And how can it reconcile the interest in wanting to externalize with its role as a normative-based power, and also thinking about, Matteo, what you said about the increased influence of agencies like Frontex in the near neighborhood, and the risk and the real risk of a lack of accountability, right? A lack of transparency in those, in the actions that it's undertaking, right? So how can we mitigate this threat that is maybe a double-edged sword?
Before I give you the floor, I think we do have a little time left, and therefore I would suggest that Magda and John Erik ask their questions immediately, and then you can pick and choose.
Thank you. I have I think this is a question to all of you, but specifically to Joanna. Specifically since the fairly fast reactions towards the Russian aggression against Ukraine, I think internally we are self-confirming the story that, well, there is unity and we can actually act fast. Is it, from your experience, I mean, your daily work is with the external actors. Do they see it this way? Or is it our, self-affirming story that no one hears?
Sorry, I think there's something deceptive about the vocabulary that's being used in terms of enlargement, because it simply just implies that the system that is existing now is simply widened. But when it adopts a new member, it changes. So if you think about the European Union basically as a confederal system or an intergovernmental organization, then you can add another member with few other costs. And that seems to be the language now. But the European Union is a constitutional entity. So whenever it includes one more member, it is reconstituted. Maybe that issue also becomes more pressing. And that has to do with the issue of threats. This is a very subtle way of thinking about it. But when you add new countries with particular challenges, the obligations of dealing, or the burden on dealing with these for the European Union, the internal problems from doing so, the digestive problems actually increase. So would it help to change the vocabulary on this to say that, look, the European Union is more than an international organization. It is a constitutional entity. And when we are adding new members, we also take on new obligations, especially, for instance, with Ukraine. I think we have to put that on the table and say, look, this will cost. And if we do it, we have to put the money where the mouth is. Otherwise, we will have some very negative surprises down the road. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What we will do is now we have 8 minutes left for the answers. That means 2 minutes per person. The floor is yours.
That's usually how much I have in the UN to present national statement. No problem. Okay. On the counterbalance of China and Russian narrative and related to the question on institutions, we don't need new institutions. We need more money and more manpower and more brain power for already created institutions dealing with disinformation and with communication as such. So please not no to new institutions, but just do better with what we have. But I would be very reluctant to use this colonial, anti-colonial thing while counterbalancing this narrative, because it's very easily will, fire back, especially when sorry for saying that about our colleagues from France, from Belgium, going to our African colleagues and trying to convince them to anything. It's automatic rejection. So we need to use it in a very, very delicate way. Chinese interference and the suppression of academic freedom. I spent 4 years in China just observing how much these freedoms are suppressed. And it's not only the problem of the suppression of individual freedoms of researchers, but also in a longer perspective, it's the suppression that results in a lack of information provided to the leaders. So it deprives the leadership from getting the critical thinking and verified information. So they are practically shooting themselves in this way by suppressing that. But I think that's a threat that has been already managed in most part of democratic world by closing the Confucius Institutes, or at least limiting their presence, and also by doing more with the checking what actually Chinese scholars or Chinese institutions are doing. Still, there is a lot to be done, but I think the direction is correct, because it was a huge threat. Conditionality. I love this question. Conditionality of the EU assistance. As I said in the first part, developing countries know how to count. And they now are absolutely aware of the risk related to the Chinese investment, learning the hard way from the examples of Uganda airport and Sri Lanka Hambantota port, just to quote 2 of them. But they don't like us when we come and we say, we will give you this money, but first of all, could you please align with our position on LGBT rights, on gender issues, and then we will think. So you start to be conditional before even the offer is on the table. So that's something that is risky. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would focus on issues linked to disinformation, because I think that we should put much more money and more people to tackle this. I remember there was a so-called task force established years ago within the European External Action Service, and they were struggling for years to get enough people paid for this, and especially ahead of the European Parliament election, but also ahead of all our internal elections. I think we have to strengthen our forces and our means, at least to closely monitor what is going on, because even Russia managed to interfere in the US elections, it seems. Yes? So they can also do it, and they know that we are now, of course, weakened by the war in Ukraine, that we have to agree everything within 2027. So there is a big appetite for this interference, and we do not have, as you said, a digital autonomy in terms of infrastructure. So de facto, we also do not have enough control. But there are means. There are means to monitor. There are means to counteract disinformation, and to have a very serious attitude towards this. So only now, as I already mentioned, there will be a package, and the defense of democracy package of the European Commission proposed, which also I think is aimed at, so that we a bit have a knowledge and monitoring about even the interference of China on NGOs, on academic entities, so who gets money from them. Yeah, of course, there is always a threat if you ask then member states to produce transparency registers, yes, because there is, of course, a threat of so-called gold plating, yes, so that some NGOs will be punished, which should not be punished, yes, so like it is. And the final issue on this conditionality, I remember that during a conference of the EU ambassadors representing the External Action Service, so they complained a lot about this issue, that others go and make deals while we first have to discuss a lot of conditions. On the other hand, I think this conditionality and these values are also our trademark. So it's, of course, very difficult now to balance this. Thank you.
Okay, I probably have like less than a minute left, judging. But so I try to respond quickly to some questions. First, I'm going to echo the first statement that I don't think the EU needs institutions. It needs human capital and capacity. Especially, EU has very good and very sophisticated knowledge about itself and the United States. Very little about the rest of the world, especially when it comes to engaging. So for me, it's like after living in China, I was impressed with Americans who came, like either from State Department, from think tanks, from academia. All of them are Mandarin speakers. All of them actually spoke dialects, whatever China calls dialects, they're separate languages. But they came and they had this very sophisticated knowledge of China. EU is light years behind our partners across the Atlantic and other actors when it comes to engaging in this way. In this way, I hear very much what you said about colonial, post-colonial. I totally agree. It's whataboutism is kind of dangerous here, but I think we also need to acknowledge past injustice. And I think, quote unquote, collectively, the West has not been there, and the trauma of that experience has not been acknowledged sufficiently in a way that then allow us to start conversations about how we deal. In terms of influence, again, here I hear about Chinese influence. I think the EU is now about to start developing a handbook on working with authoritarian, or on universities working with authoritarian countries, which is a good move. Another person who is behind it is Ivana Karaskova, who used to be behind the Chinfluence, Map Influence projects in Czech Republic. She now moved to advisor to the Commission on that. I'll be cautious here because one of the many identities is an Australian. We have developed this in Australia 4 years ago now. And many academics, myself included, lost our jobs because we were not considered to be sufficiently critical of China. And there has been an exodus since 2018 of academics from Australia who were not. So I think where decoupling comes in, it's also, like the risking is one thing, but also I think for me, I don't like Barroso very much, but his PCR statements, what he said about it, we're living in a PCR world, where he says, like, China is our partner, so is the United States. China is our competitor, so is the United States. China is our rival. He stopped himself from saying yet that the United States is our rival, although you imply it. So I think in this context of this PCR world that we are living, we need to be, again, human capacity and human capital, how to navigate the complexity of this world. And that's where I'm going to stop for the time being. Conditionality I'm going to answer later.
Maybe just a final comment on conditionality and about externalization. I mean, I think it really shows how when the EU has problem with his democracy inside, sometimes is left with no other choice that manage the crisis in the way they did, for instance, externalizing the immigration crisis. Of course, it's arguable from normative, also from strategic point of view, and so on. But I think the only alternative to that is have more robust internal institutions that are able to take a different decision. There was no condition for that. And I think there are not shortcuts on that, then not reform this institution. And of course, the enlargement has always been a powerful moment to push for this internal reform. It was in the past, and probably it will be also in this in the discussion that has to come.
Thank you so much for your interventions, for your answers, and for this incredibly rich last round table. Thank you so much. And so I'm very happy to say that we're nearly done. And I would thank John, Erik, and Magda, and of course the Jagiellonian University for the organization. Thanks a lot.
Almost done, but not entirely. So please come back to this room for the final remarks, which should take really a couple of minutes in, what, 5 to 10 minutes, I think. Okay? Because, yeah. So please don't go too far from the room as for now.
so that nobody is allowed to leave the room until at least 6 o'clock. So you have to hear you have to hear us rehearsing whatever transpired at this conference at excessive length.
There is back door.
Yeah, this has been a great pleasure. It's been really nice to work with you, and I think these 2 days have shown that what we started out with is still highly relevant. There are twists and turns in terms of the world, and we talked about this, and we're struggling with it. But the basic framework and the ideas that we have been working on are still very relevant. But I think also these 2 days have shown that there's a lot of stuff still to be done to follow this. So, la lotta continua.
I would like to share a few last words and to thank those who were contributing to organizing this event. The Kraków team. The Kraków team is not in the room, but I trust you will pass the information that I was thanking all of them. Specifically Monika Nowak, Sylwia Boryka, Anita Niton, Svetlana Baranova, Paulina Pilipiuk, who were spending, long days and weeks helping us to organize. Nothing would really happen here without our great students who were helping all the way. Paweł Boszyński, Marianna Huzyl, Oliwia Kowalczyk, Anita Niewiadomska. I would like to extend the thank you to the Kraków research team, Professor Mach, Marcin Zubek, Natasza Styczyńska, Kaśka Zielińska, Karolina Czerska-Szo, Elodie, Devenin, Marta Warat. So it's a great team. Most of them are in the room and some left already. And Kinga Sekerdej and Przemysław Tacik, who was not here, but supporting us very strongly. And of course, the Kraków team wouldn't make it, the event for you, if we would not receive help from our arena team supporters. So thank you very much to Vilja Luleviciute, Tyra Staver, Raquel Ugarte Diaz, and of course, all of this under the caring, wise, supportive leadership of Erik Fossum. Thank you very much for all years of this project, and specifically last weeks of an intensive work that led to this event that I hope was successful and that you enjoyed the meetings and panels and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. We operate CNN style. So I would very much like to thank Magda, Professor Cisla Mak, and all the team here also in Krakow, as well as, of course, our own team at Arena, both Tyra, Vilja, and all our assistants also in Oslo, and also Geir and Marit, who were with us earlier on this project and helped to make this foundation, and all our colleagues in the project, and also, of course, the European Commission and the European Union for making this possible in the first place. And I would also like to thank our advisory board members. All of those that are affiliated have contributed. And Raquel, I'm sorry, Raquel. I have to thank you, of course, from Oslo too. So, our collaborators in the other projects, and I was saying the advisory board, all the members who have been with us from the beginning and contributed throughout the process, and also we would have liked to have a few words from on reflections. totally informal and with no basic preparations. But would you like to start, Francis?
Okay. You want. Well, thanks very much to both of you, and of course I remember when Jan Erik asked me to be on the advisory board, and I was very impressed that you had an opening conference in Lewis in Rome, and then you already announced the closing conference would be in the wonderful city of Krakow. So I said, that's very nice starting and closing conference. So thanks very, very much for inviting me. And I've certainly very much enjoyed these two days. And I think for two different aspects of it. Firstly, to learn of the research that has been carried out, some of the research packages, which I found extremely stimulating and interesting yesterday. And then, of course, the implications of that for the future of the European Union. Like some of the participants, I was perhaps a little bit puzzled by differentiation and dominance as starting points. But differentiation was clearly a really critical feature of the current EU and will be of the future EU. So I could understand the relevance of that much more. Dominance, I was less convinced, but as I think I mentioned yesterday in my question, I was impressed by the research by Magda and Natasha showing that 20% of the comments that came up, almost 20%, related to some aspects of dominance. And that it wasn't just Eurosceptics and sovereigntists, but it was also people with other perspectives of the European Union. And I thought yesterday a lot of the presentations were really insightful and fascinating, such as the analysis of media coverage, the analysis of national parliaments, contributions in the Future of Europe debates, public support for different concepts such as core Europe, two-speed Europe, à la carte Europe, opt-outs. I found all of those really insightful and really interesting. And of course, all comments such as Europe on networks and thought communities and the distinction, as someone mentioned also today, between the statists and the pragmatists. I found all those extremely helpful. And of course, today we've learned about the linkages with other parts of the world and so on, and the external implications. Then, of course, we move on to the discussions, some yesterday, some today, on both the current governance of the European Union and where the European Union might go in the future. Obviously, the relevance of your project for the ongoing debate on Europe, on the future of Europe. I found it really interesting, though, that not one person, I think, in the course of the 2 days mentioned the conference on the future of Europe and the conclusions, which are in abeyance. And I'm not very happy. I don't know what the rest of you feel. I'm not very happy by what's happened, because I was very privileged to be in Dublin. I actually was an observer for 3 days at the citizens panel, one of the 4 citizens panels. One was in Florence, I forget. Was one in Poland? I think one was. But anyway, one was in Dublin, and it was really fascinating to watch. I think all of you would have been really interested to see these 100 citizens, 200 citizens, I think, chosen at random, and their participation in different aspects of the debate on the future of Europe, including many of the issues which came up today. But one of my favorite conversations, I had some informal discussions with some of the citizens. And yes, they were self-selecting, because although they'd been chosen at random, they'd agreed to travel and to take part in it. So I think they were disproportionately in favor of European integration. But some of them were very interesting. They loved working together with the other Europeans. And, Portuguese, talking to Finns, and they really enjoyed that. But my favorite conversation was an Italian about my own age from Feltre on the edge of the Dolomites. And I said, how did you find this exercise? And he said, I've absolutely loved it. I've been a small businessman in my area. I've never really reflected on these issues. So it's been wonderful for me to start reflecting on what kind of Europe do we want in the future? He said, I have no illusions that what we've recommended will come to any immediate fruition, but it could be very relevant for my children, or perhaps even more for my grandchildren. So I haven't yet read all the papers. I've had a quick look at some of them, which were circulated just before the conference. So I'm looking forward very much to read them, and I'm looking forward to the follow-up of this project and how it links in with some of the other projects that Francisco described yesterday, the massive number of projects financed by the Commission. And I noticed today, I'm sure you noticed, that just today they've announced that CEPS and SWP Berlin have set up a high-level group bolstering EU democracy as a kind of sounding board on many of the issues which you've covered today. So thank you again for permitting me to take part in this exercise. I wish I'd been able to contribute more in the course of the project, but I've really enjoyed seeing the starting point and seeing all the wonderful research you've carried out in the meantime. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks. So I would also speak on behalf of the advisory board. It strikes me that the advisory board is almost a form of differentiated integration in itself, insofar as you get to eat the donuts, but you don't have to write the papers. And for me, that's the best form of conference participation. I've only been to a few of your events. I went to the Rome one at the very beginning and to this one at the end. And I think it's a hallmark of the people involved that you create a very engaging and friendly atmosphere, and also one in which we can talk in some depth. And I found both of the conferences that I was able to attend really marked by that atmosphere. I mean, these are tricky things to organise. It goes without doubt, right? In other words, not just that we're dealing with the moving target that is the EU, that seems to be moving ever faster as the years pass, but that one is looking to find some kind of unity across a wide number of people doing a range of different cuts at the European Union, and using these big macro concepts as a way of organising that project. And I found that effective. I mean, I think it's clear that we're increasingly beyond an approach to European integration focused on explaining how the process happens, what drives it. More than that, I think it's clear that we are in a phase of study where we're looking beyond particular institutions and how institutions relate to each other. I think one of the interesting things about each of these Ds that this project has been centered on is that they cut across institutions. And of course, they also can travel beyond the EU. So this is, I think, the way in which to study this particular political context at the moment, as a way of looking beyond just a focus on institutions and the drivers of integration, and a way of doing work that has some potential relevance beyond the European Union. And I think if there's a particular value to European studies for those who are not doing European studies, maybe it has something to do with the way in which one can study big political normative questions in a fairly empirical fashion and do the kind of work which I think is exemplified here, bring together two different kind of researchers, essentially, and those who are interested mainly in concepts and normative thinking, and those who are looking at the European Union from an empirical perspective and making it come together in some fashion. And I think this, to my mind, has been really valuable. I know that Jon Erik doesn't rest on his laurels and is probably already initiating a number of further mega projects of this kind, which hopefully we'll have the chance to meet under the umbrella of in the coming years. But for now, I would simply reiterate thanks to the ARENA team, to the Krakow team. I've really enjoyed my role on the advisory board, and I highly recommend this as a way of doing academic participation in conferences.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'd like to make three more comments. One is that when Johan Olsen established ARENA, he said that it should have two basic purposes. One was, of course, to understand the transformations you have in Europe, what type of political system was developing in Brussels, as well as how were the states transformed by the integration process. So that was the first objective. The second objective, which he thought was equally important, was to ask, what can our understanding of the European process tell us for the social sciences? I think, so that to me, the two-pronged objectives is the critical issue. And we should never forget the second one. Therefore, always to be engaged with what goes on mainstream in our own disciplines, so that we don't simply become area specialists. Because, I mean, when I was in Canadian studies, the area studies was, especially among those who were based in Canada, it was the refuge of the scoundrel. It was the people who could not fit in and qualify in their own disciplines, who vacated into this area where they could talk about things in a much more loose fashion. That's not good enough. You have to have credibility in your own discipline in order to have credibility in European studies. I mean, I don't think anything works without that. So that interaction between the two is critically important. My second point was that we have been talking about dominance, and some people have reacted to this. Of course, it's a main normal theme in political theory and so on. And but I know some people are a bit more finicky about this, because I think it's a strong concept, a normative, evaluative concept, and so on. And then I thought back to something that came out in 1991 in Canada, the Spicer Report. This was a royal commission that traveled around Canada and listened to people what they felt about Canada. And Canada is one of the best places in the world to live. But if you read the Spicer Report, it is absolutely filled with stories of dominance. I mean, it's reeking of dominance. I mean, you were thinking that you were living in a hellhole, not in one of the greatest places. So there are some very interesting things about the discourse that are not necessarily totally connected to the empirical reality. So that's another thing. We are therefore, in many of the accounts we have had here, have been stories of people's perceptions of dominance, but those also have to be held up against what's going on the ground in order to see, okay, what do we have? So we also have to be critical in terms of how we apply these concepts and try to make clear delineations so that we don't group or over use the concept too. But it's an important concept, and I think it's justified to keep it. And I think this project, the research in the project, has shown the merits of doing so, and I think we should be doing that more. But it's also a concept we have to be careful about in the general setting, because it feeds into a broader discourse. But I think looking at this in a broader sense, it is a necessary element to have in our research. Now, the third thing is, I was fascinated when I was doing my PhD in Canada, because they went through probably the largest constitutional introspection in modern history. One of the foremost experts said that they had the record, a Guinness Book record of constitutional talk. So that was sort of my background before I came back to Europe, having followed this, and this was an agonistic discourse on who we are, what kind of society are we living in. It was not necessarily always well-tempered, but it was civil, at a certain level at least. So I took that with me coming back to Europe, because that was a very important constitutional introspection on identity and so on, and it has spawned a very rich body of reflection, especially academic reflection, that is at a very high level. It's one of them. Some of the most advanced works have come out of this among the theorists, and they were of course also deeply inspired by not only Charles Taylor, but also they drew on Habermas and other theorists and Foucault and so forth. So you had a rich body that they were drawing on, and they were relating that to their own experience. So my supervisor, Alan Cairns, was among these people actively involved in this, and then I went back to Europe and met with him, and he said, now I have been involved in the Canadian experience, but you are involved in an even larger experience, or the experiment, the European experiment. And I was always thinking about this. He said, there are so many uncertain things, and you have the privilege of being involved in these ongoing debates. I mean, it is of necessity, but it's also an extremely important intellectual challenge. And we have been asked to do things about policy advice and so on, but the research we do, the ideas we come up with, the frameworks that we develop, they matter. it's not how many policymakers and so on we speak to, but the fact that we can develop and engage ourselves with getting a greater understanding and communicating that, and together with our students and going on and conveying that into society is important. So it's an exciting, sometimes quite even traumatizing and sometimes quite exhausting undertaking, but it's also very exciting. And it's not only a necessity, but it's also a privilege to be involved in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's the end of the day 2. Enjoy Krakow weather. Yeah. And dinner. Yes, and for those of you who are staying, to announcement, tomorrow at 10 in the morning, you can join us for EU3D Open Lecture that will be given by Jonathan White on emergency politics. And for those of you who are staying, 7:45 we meet in front of Logos Hotel to go for the informal dinner with beer. We have a reservation. So 7:45 in Logos Hotel downstairs, so it's over the corner from Krupnicza 30 Hotel. Whoever wants to join us, whoever stays in Krakow, please do have some fun with us as well.